You're looking at a dead man. That's right. You've never seen a dead man speak, have you? Or you may have seen someone die, perhaps seen a dead body at a funeral, but you've never seen someone who was dead for 4 days, alive, talking and walking around. Yes, I'm Lazarus, the man Jesus raised from the dead. My sisters, Mary and Martha, and I occupy a rather prominent place in the gospel story, perhaps even more prominent than you know. You probably remember the time Jesus came to our house while Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus and her sister Martha was fussing in the kitchen. You'll remember Martha chiding Mary for not helping and asking Jesus to tell Mary to help out. It was then that Jesus told Martha not to get so upset that Mary had chosen the better way. That was a bit of a shock to all of us who were there. You see, in our day, the men were the ones to do the studying and talking. It wasn't unusual for men to be sitting next to Jesus talking about these things, but the women were supposed to be in the kitchen doing those kinds of things. Jesus' words endorsing what Mary was doing took all of us by surprise. But then Jesus said many things to and about women that gave them a much more exalted position in our society than any man I know. I don't know just exactly how my family and Jesus became so close. We had known Joseph and Mary, and our families had been together through the years, and I guess we just became close through all that contact. So maybe it was only natural that when Jesus began his public ministry, our home became his home. You know, Jesus never had a home of his own once he left Nazareth. In fact, I remember one time when someone wanted to follow him, he said, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He had no home of his own, but he knew he was always welcome in our home. And he and his disciples spent many nights as our guests. It was a place for Jesus to get away. As more and more people came to know him, it seemed he never had time for himself. There was always someone who wanted something, people pressing in on him from every side. When he came to our house, at least for a little while, he could relax. I wish I could tell you what it was like to be the friend of Jesus. He was an unbelievable person. Oh, I know, he was the Messiah, the Son of God. I guess we knew that and we believed it. After all, Mary had told us the circumstances of his birth, and we had witnessed countless times when he had performed miracles. But I guess we didn't think of him that way. He was just Jesus, a friend, the best friend anyone could have. Whenever he would visit, he'd always pitch in and help around the house. He had been a carpenter, you know, and so if there was anything that needed fixing, well, he just did it. We were always fascinated by his interpretations of Scripture. It was like he could take the most complicated things and make them simple. Things I could never understand before suddenly became crystal clear. When he came to our house, even with crowds sometimes waiting outside, there was a peace that I can't explain. Well, I suppose you're anxious to hear just what happened to me. To tell you the truth, most of what I can tell you comes from Martha and Mary, my sisters. They were the ones who later told me all that had happened. Actually, the only thing I remember about anything is being sick. It started with a fever. I was very weak. I told Mary I was going to lie down, told her about the fever. She got a cold towel and put it on my head. It felt so good. I know I lay there for several days, and the fever just wouldn't seem to go away. They tell me that I was often delirious. I can remember the look on their faces and knowing by their concerned look that my condition was serious. I heard them talking about calling for Jesus. I know what they were thinking. We'd all seen Jesus cure so many diseases and illnesses. Surely he would be able to help me. As I said, that's all I remember, for it was shortly after that time that I died. Oh, if you would have asked me, even before I died, what would happen, I could have told you, as funerals in that part of the country were all pretty much alike. There was a time some years before when people would go to all sorts of extremes at funerals. People were anointed with the most costly spices, and then often buried with their prized possessions and all sorts of other material goods. Why, one family would try to outdo the other in extravagant funerals. Then Gamaliel, the great rabbi, came along, saying he wanted only the most simple of ceremonies for his death, and little by little people began to change, and funerals became very simple. Bodies were dressed in a long linen cloth. The Hebrew word for that is translated traveling dress. Quite appropriate, don't you think? Then, hands and feet were wrapped in burial bandages. I also knew that I would be buried in the family burial cave not too far from where we lived. Because of the hot climate, burial often took place the day of the death, as bodies would begin to decay very quickly in the hot sun. So I knew that one day I would go that road. Mary and Martha have told me exactly what happened, and I was buried just as I described, just as I knew I would be. What I could not know is what would happen next. Mary and Martha had sent word to Jesus that I was sick, thinking he would come running, but he didn't. In fact, it was several days later when he came. At the time, I had been dead for 4 days. Martha said she heard that he was coming and went out to the road to meet him. She feels bad about it now, but at the time she was angry that Jesus had taken so long, and she blurted out, "Lord, if you had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died." After they talked, she went to get Mary, and Mary said she told Jesus the same thing. They both said Jesus spent quite a bit of time with them there on the road. Jesus never did come to the house, at least not right away. They told me that Jesus was quite broken up and that he wept openly. He then asked to be taken to the tomb. When they got there, I guess he asked for the stone to be rolled away from the entrance to the cave, but they told him not to because the stench of death would be too great. Everyone thought he just wanted to have one last look at his friend, I guess. Then, I'm told, he looked up to God to pray, and after he prayed, he cried out. Here's where my memory is perfectly fine. I can't tell you what happened while I was sick, or during those 4 days after my death, but I can certainly tell you firsthand what was said. It was like I was in a deep sleep and I heard these words. They sounded far away yet loud. "Lazarus, come out!" I opened my eyes. I didn't know where I was. I felt so weak. It was dark where I was, yet there was a blazing light coming from somewhere. I sat up, turned my head, and saw that the light was coming through the entrance or door. I looked around, saw the skeletons laying around me, and realized where I was. A burial tomb. What was I doing here in a burial tomb? Then, as I started to stand up, I saw that I was wearing these burial clothes and burial bandages. And then it began to dawn on me. I had been sick, and I had been buried, but I couldn't understand. Had I been buried alive? Or if I were dead, what was happening now? I couldn't understand anything. I walked to the door of the tomb, and there outside were crowds of people standing around staring at me. And then I saw him. There was Jesus standing with his arms outstretched and smiling. People were gasping. I saw one person faint to the ground, but soon others were yelling and screaming, clapping their hands, praying, dancing. Some came up to me, patted me on the back. Others stayed back, just staring, as if they were afraid to get too close. The next thing I knew, they were taking me back to the house, and everyone was talking at once, telling me what had happened, and that I had been dead no less than 4 days, decaying in the tomb, when Jesus, after praying and at the sound of his voice, had raised me from the dead. It all seemed so unbelievable. But then, there I was, so who was I to argue? It took me several days to get used to the idea. Mary and Martha told me over and over again what had happened, but I kept asking them to tell me one more time. I couldn't get enough of the story. It was so remarkable. It was the most unbelievable miracle I had ever heard of. I wish I could tell you life was easy after that. It wasn't. The religious leaders were so upset over what had happened, and The fact that countless Jews were leaving their synagogues to follow Jesus, that they immediately began to plot to kill Jesus. It was no secret to any of us, but that wasn't all. If you read in your gospel story beyond the account of Jesus is raising me from the dead, you'll also read that since so many were coming to see me, the evidence of the miracle, they also began plotting to kill me. They thought if they could get rid of the evidence and then get rid of the miracle worker, everything would get back to normal. But nothing was ever normal again. It was only a short time later that Jesus was arrested. I was there at the foot of the cross when he died. I heard his last words. Nothing you could have done would have gotten me away from Jesus, not after what he did. No threats on my life. Nothing would keep me from being there for him and doing all that I could. None of us could understand why he had to die. What had he done? Loved people? Healed people? Listened to people? Helped people? Is that the cause for death? No, it was pure fear on the part of the religious leaders. Fear that people would follow Jesus rather than follow them. When Jesus died, all of our world seemed to collapse. How often in those days didn't I wish he had left me to rot in that tomb rather than watch him die? But then, a couple days later, we began hearing reports of those who had seen Jesus alive. Many people would not believe, but then they had not been there when Jesus raised me to life. Anyone who had been at my tomb would know, yes, it was true. If Jesus could raise Lazarus after 4 days in the tomb, his Father God would and could raise Jesus from the dead. It was a few days later when we saw him. I've never been so glad to see someone. I wish I could tell you all was easy then, but it wasn't. It seemed someone was always plotting my death, as I was still the most visible evidence of a man who had power over death. But no matter how difficult life would get, I could go on, because I, perhaps more than anyone else, had felt the power of the touch of the Master's hand.